Chapter 1: Japan Islands, Isolation, and the Birth of Cultural Discipline. Japan begins not with empire, but with constraint. An archipelago stretched along the edge of the Asian continent. Japan was never fully isolated, yet never fully open. The sea both protected and limited, it filtering ideas, people, and technologies, rather than allowing uncontrolled flow. This geography did not produce weakness, it produced selectivity. From the beginning, Japan learned to survive by choosing carefully what to absorb and what to resist. Unlike river civilizations that expanded outward, Japan turned inward. Mountainous terrain compressed populations into narrow plains. Arable land was scarce. Natural disasters, typhoons, volcanic eruptions were constant reminders that stability was provisional. In such conditions, survival depended less on conquest than on coordination. This is where Japanese civilization diverges fundamentally from many others. Order was not imposed primarily through monumental architecture or divine kingship. It emerged through social discipline, ritualized behavior, and collective restraint. Harmony was not sentimental, it was functional. Early Japanese society developed around clans bound by ancestry, land, and obligation. Authority was relational rather than absolute. Power required recognition, not just force. This created a culture in which legitimacy depended on behavior, on fulfilling roles correctly within a larger whole. Individual ambition existed, but it was constrained by expectation. Religion reinforced this structure. Shinto did not present a transcendent, judgmental god. Instead, it recognized kami spirits embedded in landscapes, ancestors, and natural phenomena. The sacred was not distant, it was immediate and localized. There was no universal lawgiver demanding submission. There was presence demanding respect. This had profound consequences. Without an all-powerful deity, morality did not hinge on obedience to abstract commandments. It hinged on maintaining balance between humans and nature, between generations, between social roles. Pollution, both physical and moral, disrupted harmony. Purification restored it. This cyclical logic made failure survivable. Mistakes were not final judgments, they were imbalances to be corrected. Contrast this with civilizations built on absolute truths. When their truths fracture, collapse accelerates. Japan's worldview allowed for adjustment without existential crisis. Isolation amplified this adaptability. Japan did not reject foreign influence, it delayed it. Chinese writing, Buddhism, administrative models entered Japan selectively, often centuries after their regional emergence. Imported systems were not copied wholesale, they were domesticated. Buddhism, for example, did not replace Shinto. It layered itself on top. Where Buddhism offered metaphysics and discipline, Shinto preserved locality and continuity. The result was not contradiction, but complementarity. Japanese civilization learned to hold multiple systems without demanding resolution. This skill would later become critical. Social discipline intensified as populations grew and competition increased. Rice agriculture required precise timing, cooperation, and mutual dependence. One village's failure could threaten others. Over time, this produced a culture that prioritized predictability, routine, and responsibility. Freedom existed, but it was secondary to function. This does not mean early Japan was peaceful. Conflict was frequent. Violence was real. But violence was gradually ritualized, constrained by codes of behavior that limited chaos. Feuds followed rules. Authority depended on reputation as much as strength. The seeds of later warrior ethics were planted here not as glorification of war, but as a method to contain it. Japan's early emperors claimed divine ancestry, but their power was symbolic long before it was absolute. Ritual mattered more than command. The emperor mediated between worlds, others governed daily life. Power was already separating into layers. This separation prevented the kind of total collapse seen elsewhere. When one layer failed, others remained intact. When central authority weakened, local order persisted. Japan did not depend on a single pillar to hold civilization upright. It depended on distributed discipline. The archipelago shaped mentality. The mentality shaped institutions. Institutions shaped continuity. Japan did not seek immortality through stone. It sought durability through behavior. This is why later shocks, foreign invasion threats, forced modernization, even nuclear destruction, did not erase the civilization. The foundation was not a fixed structure. It was a method. Absorb, adapt, restrain, endure. From its earliest formations, Japan was learning how to change without dissolving. That lesson begins here, in the islands themselves, where isolation was never absolute and discipline was never optional. This is not the story of a civilization that avoided collapse by accident. It is the story of a civilization that prepared for disruption long before it arrived. This produced a civilization oriented toward maintenance, not redemption. Unlike belief systems that divide the world into sacred and profane, Shinto dissolved that boundary. Everyday life was already sacred. What was right depended on situation, role, and consequence. Consistency mattered less than appropriateness. This flexibility allowed adaptation without moral collapse. It filled gaps. Shinto did not address suffering, impermanence, discipline of the self. When Japan lost wars, changed regimes, or redefined identity, it did not need to abandon its worldview. It reinterpreted it. Failure became adjustment, not damnation. In a world without absolute gods, meaning is not guaranteed. It must be continuously renewed. Ritual does not promise salvation. It promises continuity. Shinto taught Japan how to live with uncertainty without panic. It normalized impermanence. It framed disruption as part of order, not its negation. This prepared Japan for a future defined by shocks. Modernity would arrive as a violent intrusion, foreign powers, industrial acceleration, ideological conflict. Many civilizations fractured under such pressure. Japan bent, not because it lacked belief, but because its belief system never insisted on finality. A civilization without absolute gods does not fear change in the same way. It fears imbalance, not transformation. This distinction would define Japan's path through empire, defeat, and reinvention. The sacred was never lost. It simply shifted form. And in that shift lies the secret of a civilization that modernized without fully breaking. Chapter 3: Japan, Samurai, Bushido, and the moral technology of violence. Every civilization must decide how it will manage violence. Japan chose to moralize it. The samurai did not emerge merely as warriors. They emerged as a solution to a structural problem: how to contain force without dissolving order. In a society shaped by contextual ethics and the absence of absolute moral law, violence could not be justified through divine command. It had to be disciplined internally. Bushido was that discipline. Often romanticized as a timeless code, Bushido was, in fact, a flexible system, less a written doctrine than a lived expectation. It fused Shinto reverence, Buddhist acceptance of death, and Confucian loyalty into a behavioral technology designed to regulate power. The samurai was not meant to love violence. He was meant to control it. This control was psychological as much as physical. Samurai culture emphasized restraint, composure, and readiness for death. Fear was not denied. It was rendered irrelevant. A warrior who had already accepted death could be relied upon to act decisively and predictably. This made violence legible. In many civilizations, violence erupts chaotically when authority weakens. Japan sought the opposite. By embedding violence within a moral framework, it made force stable living routine. Honor replaced salvation. Without absolute gods promising judgment, the samurai's moral horizon was immediate. Reputation mattered. Shame mattered. One's worth was not evaluated in an afterlife, but in the eyes of peers and superiors. This created intense self-regulation. Bushido did not ask whether violence was right or wrong in abstract terms. It asked whether it was appropriate, loyal, and controlled. Moral failure was not sin, it was disgrace. Disgrace was worse than death. This logic allowed Japan to maintain prolonged periods of internal order, even in the presence of armed elites. Samurai were licensed to kill, but constrained by expectations. Their identity depended on discipline, not conquest. The ritualization of violence extended to death itself. Seppuku was not glorified suicide. It was a mechanism of accountability. It allowed warriors to reclaim honor when the social order was disrupted. In effect, the individual paid the cost so the system could remain intact. This is why Bushido functioned so effectively as a stabilizing force. It redirected destructive energy inward. Rather than challenge the hierarchy, the samurai internalized failure. Violence was contained by meaning. Yet this system was not static. As Japan moved toward greater centralization, the role of the samurai evolved. Warfare decreased, administration increased. Samurai became bureaucrats, scholars, and local governors. The code adapted. Bushido expanded beyond the battlefield. Loyalty, diligence, endurance, and obedience became generalized virtues. Violence receded, but the mindset remained. The sword became symbolic. This transformation reveals an important insight. Bushido was never about fighting alone. It was about reliability under pressure. A samurai who could face death calmly could also face monotony, hierarchy, and delay. This made the class indispensable to long-term governance, but the same traits that stabilized society carried hidden risks. When loyalty is absolute and dissent is dishonorable, power becomes insulated from critique. Bushido discouraged rebellion not through fear, but through moral obligation. To question authority was to fracture harmony. This created durability, but also rigidity. Over time, the moral technology of violence expanded into a moral technology of obedience. The samurai's internal discipline became a template for broader society. Order was preserved. Adaptation slowed. When external shocks arrived, foreign powers, new weapons, new ideologies, the samurai ethic would be both an asset and a liability. It enabled rapid mobilization and sacrifice. It also discouraged questioning the direction of that mobilization. The same code that prevented internal collapse could accelerate external catastrophe. This duality defines Bushido's historical role. It was not inherently virtuous or destructive. It was a tool remarkably effective, deeply contextual, and morally ambiguous. Japan did not eliminate violence. It engineered it, and in doing so, it created a civilization capable of sustaining order without divine absolutism, yet vulnerable to self-sacrifice on a massive scale. The samurai did not disappear when their swords were retired. Their discipline migrated into institutions, workplaces, and national identity. Violence became psychological. Honor became productivity. Sacrifice became normal. Bushido outlived the battlefield. In the chapters ahead, this moral technology will be tested by centralized power, by modern war, and by defeat. The question will no longer be how to control violence within society, but how to prevent discipline itself from becoming destructive. A civilization that perfects control must eventually confront its limits. Japan's confrontation is only beginning. Chapter 5. Japan Tokugawa Order, Stability, Surveillance, and Social Engineering. The Tokugawa shogunate did not seek greatness, it sought control without movement. After centuries of civil war, Japan's ruling elites reached a sober conclusion. Progress was dangerous. Change produced rivals. Mobility produced ambition. Innovation produced disorder. Peace would be engineered, not. Tokugawa rule was therefore not heroic. It was administrative, procedural, and deliberately constraining. Its achievement was not expansion or conquest, but the successful freezing of history for more than 2 centuries. The system began with a simple premise. Warriors were no longer needed to fight, but they could not be removed. Samurai were transformed from battlefield actors into salaried bureaucrats. Violence was monopolized, ritualized, and largely suspended. This conversion was essential. A warrior class without war is unstable. Tokugawa governance neutralized this threat by binding samurai to stipends, codes, and status obligations. Honor replaced combat. Rank replaced initiative. The sword remained, but mostly as symbol. At the core of the system was surveillance, not terror. The shogunate did not rule through mass executions or constant brutality. It ruled through visibility and predictability. Everyone knew their place. Everyone was known. The class structure was rigid. Samurai, peasants, artisans, merchants. Movement between classes was discouraged, sometimes forbidden. This rigidity reduced aspiration-driven unrest. People stopped imagining alternatives. Daimyo, regional lords, were the greatest threat. They possessed land, retainers, and historical legitimacy. Tokugawa control over them was subtle and effective. The Senkin-katai system required daimyo to alternate residence between their domains and Edo. Their families remained in Edo as hostages, not prisoners, but guarantees. Wealth was drained through travel and ceremony. Rebellion became economically irrational. Control was achieved without constant force. Religion was also managed. Christianity, perceived as a loyalty system tied to foreign powers, was eradicated. Buddhism and Shinto were reorganized into registries. Faith became a bureaucratic category. Belief was tolerated. Independent allegiance was not. Information flow was constrained. Foreign contact was limited. Trade was permitted only through controlled channels. Ideas entered slowly, selectively, and under supervision. Isolation was not ignorance, it was filtration. The Tokugawa state understood that instability often arrives disguised as novelty. By narrowing inputs, it stabilized outcomes. Society became predictable. Conflict became rare. Rebellion became anomalous. But this stability came at a cost. Economic reality shifted beneath the rigid social order. Merchants, officially at the bottom, accumulated wealth. Samurai, officially superior, fell into debt. Status and power diverged. This created silent tension. The system coped by ignoring contradiction. Appearances were preserved even as substance eroded. Ritual compensated for imbalance. Etiquette substituted for reform. Tokugawa governance prioritized form over adaptation. Education expanded, but within limits. Literacy increased. Ethics were emphasized. Critical political thought was not encouraged. Knowledge was permitted. This was social engineering at scale. People internalized constraints. Obedience became habitual. Authority became impersonal. The state did not need to constantly intervene because society regulated itself. Harmony replaced justice as the dominant value. Crime existed, but it was localized. Punishment was visible and exemplary. The goal was deterrence, not rehabilitation. The system did not ask why individuals failed. It asked how failure disrupted order. This created emotional distance between ruler and ruled. The Tokugawa shogunate was not cruel, but it was indifferent. Stability mattered more than individual potential. Peace mattered more than dynamism. For generations, this bargain held. Japan experienced no large-scale internal wars. Cities grew, culture flourished within boundaries. Art, theater, and literature thrived precisely because politics did not intrude. The state receded, society stabilized, yet stagnation accumulated. When external pressure finally arrived, the Tokugawa system could not adapt quickly enough. Its strength control, through constraint, became weakness. Decision-making was slow. Authority was fragmented. Innovation had been systematically discouraged. The system that had neutralized internal threats was unprepared for external shock. Still, its achievement should not be underestimated. The Tokugawa order demonstrated that a society could be pacified without annihilation, stabilized without totalitarianism, and governed through structure rather than charisma. It was not a regime of inspiration. It was a regime of containment, and containment, for a time, worked. But history does not remain still. The very success of Tokugawa stability delayed the skills Japan would later need: adaptation, speed, and strategic flexibility. When the frozen surface finally cracked, change would be abrupt and unforgiving. Stability had postponed transformation. It had not prevented it. The question Japan would soon face was no longer how to preserve order, but how to survive in a world that no longer allowed stillness. Chapter 6: Japan, the Meiji Shock. When stillness became vulnerability, the world arrived in Japan without invitation. In 1853, black-hulled ships appeared off the coast, carrying cannon, steam power, and an ultimatum disguised as diplomacy. They did not bring conquest. They brought comparison, and comparison is more destabilizing than invasion. For 2 centuries, Japan had controlled change by narrowing its exposure to the outside world. That strategy collapsed the moment foreign power demonstrated that isolation no longer protected sovereignty. The shock was not military defeat, it was epistemic defeat. Japan discovered that its carefully preserved order existed inside a global system that had evolved without it. Technologies, institutions, and modes of warfare had advanced beyond Tokugawa assumptions. The frozen equilibrium could not respond incrementally. It had to break. The Meiji Restoration was not a revolution from below. It was a controlled demolition from within. Elites recognized that survival required transformation faster than tradition allowed. They chose destruction over irrelevance. The shogunate fell not because it was weak, but because it was slow. Authority was symbolically returned to the emperor figure, long stripped of real power. This was not a return to ancient rule, but a strategic myth. The emperor became a vessel into which modern sovereignty could be poured. Legitimacy was rebooted. Feudal domains were dismantled. Samurai privileges were revoked. Stipends vanished. The sword, once the core of status, was outlawed in public. A warrior class that had ruled for centuries was dissolved in a generation. This was not negotiated, was enforced. Resistance existed, but it was fragmented and brief. The state moved decisively, understanding that half measures would invite civil war. Modernization was executed with authoritarian clarity. Japan did not copy the West blindly, it sampled it. Institutions were studied abroad, disassembled, and selectively reassembled. Legal systems, militaries, factories, and schools were redesigned to fit Japanese social discipline. Western forms were filled with local values. Modernity was imported, but not surrendered to. Education became compulsory. Literacy turned from moral ornament into economic weapons. Science replaced cosmology as the language of power. Time itself was standardized calendars, clocks, schedules aligning society with industrial rhythm. Speed became policy. The military was reconstituted on conscription rather than class. Loyalty shifted from lord to nation. The idea of Japan expanded from domains to a collective identity anchored in state ideology. Nationalism was engineered, not discovered. Shinto was reorganized, not as faith, but as civic ritual. The emperor was elevated beyond politics into sacred abstraction. Dissent became not merely disagreement, but deviation from national essence. Modernity required cohesion. Cohesion required myth. Economic transformation followed. Railways, shipyards, and factories spread rapidly. Private enterprise was encouraged, but guided. The state did not retreat, it coordinated. Industrialization was treated as strategic defense. Capitalism arrived under supervision. The costs were real. Peasants bore tax burdens. Workers faced harsh conditions. Traditional communities fractured. The promise of equality masked new hierarchies based on education and access. Modernization did not eliminate inequality. It restructured it. Yet Japan succeeded where many societies failed. It transformed without prolonged colonization, preserved autonomy while absorbing foreign systems, and reasserted itself as a peer rather than a subject. This success carried danger. Rapid modernization produced confidence. Confidence produced ambition. The lesson internalized was not simply how to survive, but how to compete. Japan learned that power flowed from industry, discipline, and unified will. It also learned that those without such power were vulnerable. The logic was transferable. By the end of the Meiji period, Japan was no longer a civilization protecting itself from the world. It was a state preparing to act upon it. The shock had been absorbed. The stillness was gone. What replaced it was motion, deliberate, organized, and increasingly outward-facing. The tools of survival were becoming instruments of assertion. The next question was no longer whether Japan could modernize, but how it would use the capacity it had so quickly built, and whether restraint would survive success. Chapter 7. Japan Empire as Insurance. Why expansion seemed rational by the early 20th century. Japan had solved a problem that had destroyed many civilizations. It had modernized without being conquered. But survival came with a new anxiety. Modernity did not guarantee safety. It merely changed the terms of threat. In a world structured by empires, industrial capacity without strategic depth was fragile. Japan was an island nation with limited resources, growing population pressure, and an economy increasingly dependent on imported fuel, iron, and food. The very success of modernization exposed a structural weakness. Power required supply. Supply required access. Access required control. Expansion did not initially feel ideological. It felt defensive. Western empires dominated Asia through a simple logic: secure markets, extract resources, and deny rivals the same. Japan observed this system, not as a moral question, but as a strategic reality. The lesson absorbed from the 19th century was brutal and clear. States that did not expand were eventually enclosed. Korea became the first focal point, long treated as a buffer zone between powers. The peninsula was now seen as either a shield or a dagger pointed at Japan's core. Russian influence intensified the fear. Control of Korea was reframed as existential necessity. The 1894 to 1895 Sino-Japanese War shocked the world. Japan defeated a much larger Qing China with modernized forces, disciplined command, and industrial logistics. The victory shattered assumptions about Asian weakness. It also rewired Japanese self-perception. For the first time, Japan was not reacting to Western power. It was exercising it. Territory, indemnities, and prestige followed. The message was internalized. Modern war worked. Yet success brought resentment. Western powers intervened to limit Japan's gains, particularly Russia, Germany, and France. The humiliation burned deeper than defeat would have. Japan had won and still been constrained. The Russo-Japanese War, 1904-1905, was therefore not just a military conflict, but a psychological reckoning. Victory against a European empire electrified Japan and destabilized global racial hierarchies. For Japan, it confirmed a dangerous conclusion. Force commanded respect. Diplomacy followed power, not principle. Empire became a form of insurance against encirclement, against economic strangulation, against imposed inferiority. Colonial rule in Korea and later Manchuria was rationalized through modernization rhetoric, infrastructure, education, order. But these claims masked extraction, repression, and cultural erasure. Empire spoke the language of progress while practicing domination. Internally, expansion reshaped politics. The military gained prestige and autonomy. Officers increasingly believed they embodied national will more purely than civilian politicians. Strategic decisions were framed as technical necessities beyond debate. War planning became policy. Education reinforced this trajectory. Loyalty, sacrifice, and obedience were elevated as civic virtues. The emperor, already abstracted beyond human reach, was positioned as the moral axis of expansion. To question empire was to question identity. Economic interests aligned with military logic. Zaibatsu conglomerates profited from overseas resources and contracts. Industrial growth and imperial reach fed each other in a closed loop. Expansion created dependency on expansion, yet contradictions multiplied. Japan demanded equality from Western powers while denying it to colonized peoples. It opposed imperial racism while practicing cultural hierarchy. It framed itself as Asia's defender while ruling Asia by force. These tensions were suppressed, not resolved. The international order offered few alternatives. League diplomacy failed to address Japan's security concerns. Resource access remained conditional. Economic vulnerability persisted beneath industrial strength. From Tokyo's strategic vantage point, restraint looked like risk. Empire was not initially imagined as conquest for glory. It was framed as preemptive survival way to secure space, materials, and autonomy in a hostile system. But insurance, once purchased, demands maintenance. Territory required troops. Troops required justification. Justification required ideology. What began as calculation hardened into destiny. Japan was no longer asking whether expansion was right. It was asking whether stopping was even possible. The next chapter confronts the moment when insurance turned into escalation, when logic overrode caution and momentum replaced choice. Chapter 8: Japan, Total War, Total Mobilization, and the logic of no exit. By the late 1930s, Japan was no longer choosing expansion, it was managing momentum. What had begun as strategic insurance evolved into a system that could not tolerate pause. Every gain increased exposure. Every commitment created new vulnerabilities. Every attempt to stabilize the empire revealed how unstable it already was. War ceased to be an event. It became a condition. The invasion of China in 1937 marked the decisive shift. Unlike earlier conflicts, this war had no clear endpoint, no limited objective, and no agreed framework for resolution. China was vast, fragmented, and resilient. Victory was undefined. Japan entered a war it could not decisively win and could not afford to lose. The logic of total mobilization followed naturally. Industry was reorganized around military needs. Civilian consumption was curtailed. Labor, information, and culture were subordinated to the war effort. Society became an extension of the battlefield. The state did not need overt dictatorship to enforce compliance. Social discipline, institutional hierarchy, and cultural norms of endurance did much of the work. Sacrifice was not demanded as an exception, it was normalized as duty. Death became functional. Propaganda did not emphasize conquest alone. It emphasized inevitability. Japan was portrayed as encircled, misunderstood, economically threatened, and morally burdened with leading Asia against Western domination. The narrative reframed aggression as defense on a civilizational scale. Yet the contradictions sharpened. The liberation of Asia required coercion. Cooperation was enforced. Resources were extracted under military supervision. Local populations experienced empire not as protection, but as occupation. Violence escalated accordingly. In China, the war brutalized all restraints. Cities were destroyed, civilians targeted, and norms abandoned. The absence of a decisive victory radicalized tactics. When progress stalled, pressure intensified. Atrocity became a tool of frustration. Internally, dissent narrowed further. Civilian leaders lacked authority over military commands. Strategic decisions were fragmented across services, competing for resources and prestige. No institution possessed both legitimacy and power to impose restraint. Coordination existed, control did not. As global tensions increased, Japan's strategic dilemma hardened. The empire depended on imported oil, steel, and rubber supplies, dominated by Western powers, increasingly hostile to Japanese expansion. Sanctions followed. Embargoes tightened. From Tokyo's perspective, economic pressure was not neutral diplomacy. It was coercion without war, designed to force retreat without negotiation. Retreat, however, threatened collapse. Withdrawal from China would undermine military credibility, destabilize domestic politics, and expose Japan's vulnerability. The costs of stopping now appeared greater than the costs of escalation. This was the logic of no exit. War planning shifted toward securing resource independence through further expansion. Southeast Asia, rich in oil and raw materials, became the next target. But these territories were controlled by European empires and protected, directly or indirectly, by the United States. Expansion now risked global war. Diplomacy continued, but increasingly as performance rather than solution. Negotiations sought recognition of fates, a compromise, not compromise. Each side interpreted delay as weakness. Time itself became an enemy. Within the military, the belief hardened that a decisive strike could reset the strategic equation. If Japan could cripple enemy capacity early, it could force negotiation from strength. This belief underestimated industrial asymmetry and overestimated moral shock, but it aligned perfectly with institutional culture, audacity, sacrifice, and the refusal to accept gradual decline. Total war required total commitment. The population was prepared accordingly. Education intensified ideological messaging. The emperor's symbolic presence anchored legitimacy. Personal suffering was reframed as national transcendence. To endure was to serve history. When the attack came, it was framed not as aggression, but as necessity in act forced by encirclement and denial. Japan did not imagine itself choosing war. It imagined itself responding to inevitability. Yet inevitability was a story Japan told itself to avoid confronting a harder truth, that the system it had built could no longer distinguish survival from self-destruction. The machinery of mobilization was efficient. The strategy was coherent. The assumptions were fatal. Once total war began, there could be no partial loss, no limited defeat. Victory or annihilation became the only acceptable outcomes. And when outcomes narrowed to absolutes, reason itself became expendable. The next chapter examines the collapse that followed not only of cities and armies, but of the very idea that discipline and honor alone could control modern destruction. Chapter 9: Japan Defeat, Rupture, and the rewriting of the sacred Japan did not lose the war gradually. It collapsed in layers. The first rupture was strategic. By 1943, the promise of decisive shock had evaporated. Industrial asymmetry long dismissed asserted itself relentlessly. Aircraft losses could not be replaced. Shipping lanes bled. Fuel shortages grounded planes and immobilized fleets. The empire still fought, but it no longer maneuvered. The second rupture was material. Cities became targets. Modern war no longer distinguished between factory and home, worker and civilian. Firebombing reduced urban centers to ash. Tokyo burned not as a battlefield, but as infrastructure. Destruction was systematic, impersonal, and overwhelming. Civil defense rituals, bucket brigades, evacuation drills, communal endurance could not counter industrialized annihilation. Discipline met physics and lost. The third rupture was moral. The state continued to demand sacrifice, but the promise underpinning it eroded. Victory was no longer plausible. Survival itself became uncertain. Yet surrender remained unthinkable, not merely politically, but cosmologically. The emperor was divine. The nation was eternal. Defeat was conceptually impossible. This paradox forced reality to fracture belief. The atomic bomb did not simply destroy cities, it destroyed narratives. It introduced a form of violence so disproportionate that traditional frameworks are no valor. Endurance lost explanatory power. There was no bravery against a sun. When the second bomb fell, the remaining structures of certainty collapsed. Military leaders still debated continuation. Some sought annihilation over submission. Others recognized that further resistance meant extinction without meaning. The emperor intervened. For the first time, his voice entered public reality, not as myth, but as decision. In announcing surrender, he did not speak of defeat. He spoke of endurance, preservation, and the burden of the future. Even surrender was reframed as sacrifice. Yet the spell was broken. Occupation followed, and with it, a transformation unprecedented in Japanese history. The divine emperor became human. State Shinto was dismantled. Militarism was delegitimized. A new constitution renounced war itself as sovereign right. The sacred was rewritten into law. This was not mere reform. It was a civilizational inversion. Power shifted from hierarchy to procedure, from transcendence to accountability. The military was subordinated, absolutely, to civilian authority. Japan did not simply demilitarize, it redefined legitimacy. The population absorbed this rupture with astonishing speed. Not because belief was shallow, but because adaptability had always been Japan's deeper strength. Continuity was preserved not through institutions, but through social coherence. Rituals changed. The ethic of discipline remained. Economic reconstruction replaced territorial ambition. Productivity replaced conquest. Education, technology, and export capacity became new measures of national worth. Honor migrated from the battlefield to the factory floor. This transformation was not without cost. Trauma lingered. Memory fragmented. Responsibility for wartime actions remained contested, unevenly acknowledged, and politically sensitive. But the core lesson endured. Modern power could not be mastered by moral intensity alone. Japan had learned at catastrophic cost that discipline without limits becomes acceleration toward ruin. Defeat did not erase identity. It forced its recalibration. The nation that emerged was neither a broken relic nor a redeemed ideal. It was a society determined never again to confuse inevitability with destiny. The next chapter explores how Japan carried this lesson forward into economic ascent, cultural influence, and a modernity shaped not by collapse, but by containment. Chapter 10. Japan Prosperity Without Empire. Discipline rechanneled. Japan's post-war rise did not begin with ambition. It began with constraint. The nation emerged from defeat, stripped of territory, military power, and geopolitical autonomy. Security was outsourced. War was constitutionally forbidden. Strategic options narrowed to a single viable path: survival through production. This limitation became catalytic. Without empire to administer or armies to fund, resources flowed inward. Capital, labor, and political attention converged on reconstruction. The same discipline once mobilized for total war was redirected toward factories, logistics, and process optimization. The enemy was no longer another state. It was inefficiency. The developmental state took form not as central planning in the socialist sense, but as guided capitalism. Ministries coordinated industrial policy, protected infant industries, and brokered cooperation between banks, corporations, and labor. Competition existed, but it was structured. Failure was allowed, but disorder was not. Lifetime employment systems stabilized the workforce. Enterprise unions aligned labor interests with corporate survival. Social harmony became an economic asset, not merely a cultural ideal. Growth was treated as a moral project. Japanese firms pursued incremental perfection rather than disruptive gambles. Quality control, continuous improvement, and long-term thinking replaced short-term profit extraction. The concept of relentless collective refinement became the hidden engine of competitiveness. This was not innovation as spectacle. It was innovation as habit. By the 1960s and 1970s, Japan transformed from a recipient of aid into a global exporter. Automobiles, electronics, and precision machinery flooded world markets not because they were cheapest, but because they worked. Reliability became reputation. The irony was profound. Japan achieved what its imperial project had failed to secure: global influence without occupation. Its products entered homes, offices, and infrastructures worldwide, shaping daily life more deeply than armies ever could. Soft power replaced hard power almost by accident. Yet prosperity carried tension. Economic success depended on American security guarantees, creating a paradox of sovereignty. Japan was wealthy but strategically dependent, advanced but constrained. The Cold War stabilized this arrangement. Japan became a manufacturing anchor of the Western Bloc in Asia, while remaining culturally distinct and politically cautious. Pacifism hardened into identity. By the 1980s, Japan appeared unstoppable. Trade surpluses soared. Real estate prices detached from reality. Confidence edged toward hubris. The question was no longer whether Japan had recovered, but whether it would surpass the West entirely. Then the bubble burst. The collapse of asset prices did not trigger revolution or unrest. It produced stagnation, long, quiet, and psychologically corrosive. Growth slowed. Demographics shifted. Certainty evaporated. Yet even stagnation was managed with restraint. There were no mass purges, no populist implosions, no abandonment of institutions. The same social discipline that fueled ascent absorbed decline. Stability was preserved, even at the cost of dynamism. Japan chose continuity over rupture. The lesson of defeat still governed behavior. Collapse was the true enemy. Risk was calibrated. Extremes were avoided. The society accepted slower progress as preferable to instability. Prosperity without empire had been achieved, but at the price of perpetual caution. Japan had mastered survival, efficiency, and coherence. What remained unresolved was how to assert purpose in a world that no longer demanded reconstruction, but reinvention. The next chapter examines that unresolved tension: how democracy, memory, and power continue to compete over the meaning of the Japanese state itself. Chapter 11: Japan, Democracy, Memory. And the battle over meaning. Japan's post-war democracy was not born from revolution. It was installed under occupation, written into law by foreign hands, and accepted by a population exhausted by destruction. For this reason, it has always carried a quiet question at its core. Is this who we chose to be, or who we were allowed to become? That question never disappeared. It merely went dormant. Formally, Japan became one of the world's most stable democracies. Elections were regular. Institutions endured. Civil liberties expanded. Political violence all but vanished. Compared to the chaos of many post-imperial states, Japan looked exemplary. Substantively, however, power remained concentrated. The Liberal Democratic Party governed almost continuously for decades, not through repression, but through consensus, patronage networks, and bureaucratic alignment. Politics became managerial rather than ideological. Change occurred incrementally, negotiated behind closed doors rather than fought in the streets. Democracy functioned, but quietly. This quietness shaped public memory. Unlike Germany, Japan never fully ritualized guilt. War crimes were acknowledged selectively, framed ambiguously, or displaced onto abstract tragedy rather than moral responsibility. Hiroshima and Nagasaki became symbols of victimhood, while Nanjing and colonial brutality remained contested, minimized, or externalized. Memory became fragmented. To some, Japan was primarily a victim of total war and nuclear annihilation. To others, it was an aggressor that never fully accounted for its actions. These narratives coexisted uneasily, each incomplete, each politically useful. Education became a battleground. Textbooks were revised, contested, and revised again. Words like invasion were softened into advance. Responsibility was blurred into inevitability. The goal was not denial so much as ambiguity, an attempt to preserve national cohesion by avoiding moral absolutism. Shame was managed, not eliminated. Supporters argued that Japan must become a normal nation, again capable of self-defense, deterrence, and regional leadership. The debate was not merely strategic, it was existential. What does strength mean for a nation defined by defeat? What does sovereignty mean when memory is unresolved? Meanwhile, demographic decline accelerated. An aging population strained welfare systems. Rural regions emptied. Immigration remained limited, constrained by cultural homogeneity and political caution. The future began to feel narrower than the past. Youth disengagement grew not in rebellion, but in apathy. The political system endured, yet inspiration faded. Stability persisted, but vision blurred. Japan was no longer rebuilding, no longer catching up, no longer collapsing. It was simply continuing. And continuation, without narrative, is fragile. Japan's democracy had succeeded in preventing catastrophe. It had preserved peace, order, and prosperity. But it struggled to articulate why the state existed beyond maintenance, beyond avoidance of past failure. The battle over meaning intensified quietly in classrooms, courts, media, and diplomatic language, not over whether Japan should survive, but over what it should stand for. The final chapter confronts this unresolved tension directly. Japan's position between tradition and transformation, restraint and assertion, memory and necessity, and whether a nation can remain disciplined forever without redefining its purpose. Chapter 12. Japan, Between Tradition and Transformation. An unfinished identity. Japan enters the 21st century without collapse, without revolution, and without a clear endpoint. This is its paradox. Unlike empires that shattered or nations that reinvented themselves through rupture, Japan has moved forward through controlled continuity. The same civil service traditions persist. The same corporate hierarchies endure. The same cultural codes restraint, obligation, collective harmony still structure daily life. Change occurs, but rarely announces itself. Japan does not break, it bends. This has been its greatest strength, its most persistent limitation. Culturally, Japan remains deeply rooted in pre-modern sensibilities. Shinto's reverence for place and continuity still shapes attitudes toward land, ancestry, and belonging. Social roles remain clearly defined, even as they are slowly renegotiated. The past is not discarded. It is layered beneath the present. Modernity, therefore, never replaced tradition. It was absorbed. High-speed rail runs past ancient shrines. Robotics coexist with ritual. Corporate meetings follow Confucian hierarchies while negotiating global markets. Japan did not secularize in the Western sense. It proceduralized belief, turning ethics into habit rather than doctrine. This allowed Japan to modernize without cultural annihilation. But it also produced friction. Economic stagnation exposed the limits of consensus governance. Lifetime employment eroded, but expectations of loyalty remained. Gender roles shifted in law, but lagged in practice. Innovation thrived technologically, while stagnating institutionally. Japan became hypermodern on the surface and conservative at its core. Geopolitically, the country occupies an equally ambiguous position. It is Western aligned, but not Western. Asian, but culturally distinct. Militarily constrained, yet strategically central. Sovereign, but interdependent with the United States for security. Japan is a pillar of the existing order, yet uneasy with power. It remembers too well where unchecked ambition once led. Imperial overreach ended not only in defeat, but in moral disorientation. The lesson internalized was not never again injustice, but never again excess. Discipline replaced ideology. This is why Japan's rearmament debates remain cautious, legalistic, incremental. Power is discussed in terms of necessity, not destiny. Force is framed as deterrence, never mission. Even as capabilities grow, rhetoric remains restrained. Japan seeks influence without dominance, yet restraint has costs. Regional leadership demands clarity. Global crises demand initiative. Younger generations, less bound by war, memory question why Japan hesitates while others assert. The fear is no longer militarism, but irrelevance. At the same time, demographic decline accelerates toward structural transformation. Fewer workers support more elders. Automation compensates, but community erodes. Rural Japan fades. Urban Japan compresses. The nation feels smaller, older, quieter. This is not decay boot contraction. Japan must now answer a question it has postponed for decades. Can a civilization built on continuity redefine itself without rupture? The answer remains unresolved. What Japan demonstrates to the world is neither triumph nor tragedy, but endurance without myth. It shows that a society can absorb defeat, modernize without erasure, and preserve cohesion without coercion. It also shows the risk of endless management of surviving so carefully that purpose dissolves into procedure. Japan's story is not finished because it has refused finality. It has chosen balance over climax, adaptation over proclamation, memory over myth. In a world obsessed with rise and fall, Japan stands as a different case, a civilization that redirected its discipline inward. turned power into restraint, and modernized without burning its past. Whether this path leads to renewal or quiet diminishment will depend on choices yet to be made about identity, responsibility, and meaning. Japan remains what it has long been, a nation between worlds, sustained by discipline, haunted by memory, and still deciding who it is allowed to become. End of the Japan series. Epilogue: Japan and the Art of Endurance. Japan's story does not end with conquest, collapse, or final victory. It ends, if it can be said to end at all, with continuity under pressure. Across more than a millennium, Japan repeatedly faced forces that shattered other civilizations: internal civil war, rigid hierarchies, technological shock, imperial overreach, total defeat, and nuclear devastation. Yet again and again, Japan absorbed rupture without dissolving its core identity. The country did not survive by resisting change blindly, nor by surrendering entirely to it, but by disciplining transformation itself. Unlike civilizations built around universal gods, expansionist missions, or absolute truths, Japan evolved within a moral ecosystem that emphasized balance, duty, impermanence, and restraint. Shinto offered reverence without dogma. Buddhism provided meaning without command. Confucian ethics structured society without erasing flexibility. Together, they formed a culture capable of reconfiguration without existential panic. Power in Japan was rarely illusory, but it was often indirect. Emperors endured by becoming symbolic. Shoguns ruled by delegating violence to codes. Samurai legitimized force through moral discipline. Even modern institutions preserved this pattern. Authority framed as responsibility, hierarchy tempered by obligation, and change justified as preservation. Modern Japan, rebuilt from ruins after 1945, did not erase its past to become modern. It reorganized it. The ethic of discipline, once forged in feudal loyalty, became industrial precision. Communal obligation transformed into corporate and civic order. Shame and honor, once tied to sword and clan, migrated into social trust and professional integrity. Japan's endurance does not imply perfection. Its history includes exclusion, suppression, militarism, and silence around trauma. But its uniqueness lies in how crises were metabolized rather than denied how meaning was. Rebuilt without demanding ideological purity or civilizational rebirth. In a world increasingly defined by fracture, polarization, and collapse, Japan offers neither a universal model nor a moral utopia. What it offers instead is rarer, a demonstration that civilizations can modernize without self-annihilation, that identity can persist without rigidity, and that survival itself can be an art. Japan did not conquer the world. It learned how not to be destroyed by it, and that may be its most enduring legacy.